All right. Welcome, friends and comrades, to our latest episode of Emancipations podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Tut. I'm joined today by Gabriel Tupinambá, longtime comrade and friend of the show, who actually was part of our very first study collective on the work of Sylvain Lazarus and has subsequently appeared to offer various seminars on psychoanalysis, including a wonderful seminar which is on our page. I think all of the videos are now public. Maybe a few are on the Patreon, which was actually on the Marxism of Badiou. But apparently we didn't fully figure out the Marxism of Badiou because we've decided to investigate it further in today's conversation. But I also realized that Gabriel has joined us for introductions to two other contemporary thinkers, Kojin Karatani and Jean-Claude Milner. So welcome back to the program. How are you today?
Good, tired but good.
Nice to
and
see
happy
you.
to be here.
It's very nice to have you back. So we already have a few questions from comrades from the Discord and from the Patreon, interested to learn a little bit about how things are going with the translation of your book into Portuguese. And we can get to some of those questions later, but because you've been very active and we're very curious to see how that work is going. If folks didn't know, Gabriel actually launched his book with Northwestern University Press in 2022 on our channel for a very dynamic set of sort of presentations, including a few of them got us in very big trouble because Zizek came and it was all kinds of drama. But we survived it somehow after making ample apologies to him, if I remember correctly. I'm not going to talk about that further. But today we want to discuss Alain Badiou's work. Gabriel has actually just recently, and maybe you could start by telling us about this event. It seems to me that in Brazil, Badiou has I don't know about like more practitioners or sort of students or followers than in the US, but you guys all gathered for some kind of conference. What was that about? And what was your presentation? I saw some photos and I heard it was really nice.
Yeah, no, it's. I think it's the first kind of internet. It was the first international conference around his work. The second conference at all, the second like academic event at all, if I'm not mistaken, about his work in Brazil. It was put together by a good friend called Lucas Negri, who I think already engaged with your channel before, if I'm not mistaken, as well. And it was a pretty special occasion because I think it consolidated a very long but still quite recent effort by many people to bring, I guess, Badiouian scholarship more into Brazil, because unlike Argentina, which had a kind of early reception, especially through Althusser, of his work, Brazilian reception of his work was very scattered, very mediated by Lacanian schools in the 90s, and then which was around the time that they translated Being an Event to Portuguese, and then nothing. And then around 2013, 2014, there was a resurgence of interest to a couple of people like Vladimir Safatli and others. And I think that it was an interesting thing to have this event, because we had very interesting international kind of commentators and thinkers joining us. But I felt like it was very clear that there was a difference in approach to his work from this kind of Brazilian community of people engaging with it, from the very brilliant people that were invited, like Oliver Feltham, Yana, and others who spoke about Badiou. you could really feel the kind of the difference. And so I had the honor of doing the kind of the final, I don't know how to call this, like the closing lecture for this. And I decided to do something very cheeky, which was to write a letter to Badiou, a long letter. I actually was planning to do this before the conference. I ran out of ideas on what to do, so I decided to write the letter and pretty much present it during the conference. I did send it to him afterwards, which is, I mean, you know, so it wasn't purely performative, but it was a really good exercise for me, and an attempt to kind of summarize my own engagement with his work, which is kind of curious because I don't think I've ever published a text strictly on his work. Like, it's not something that I've done academically. I mean, I've done a postdoc where he was one of the main kind of authors in my proposal for research, but I didn't publish anything out of that. And my engagement with him has been mostly informal and through opportunities to talk about my interpretation of his work, organizing study groups, but never really like a very scholarly thing.
Does this kind of hint at this division of approaches that you mentioned a moment ago? And if it does, can you elaborate? Because we've talked about this before, right? There's kind of the question about Badiou's entry into popularity in the American Academy, which came about in the early 2000s, maybe, yeah, I think the early 2000s. And this kind of academia, brought the university discourse apparatus to Badiou. What it also allowed was, at least in political socialist circles, communist circles, Badiou's work, the trilogy of being an event, although Logics of Worlds didn't come out, I think, until 2007 in English. People had the feeling that they had to, it was mandatory to read Badiou and to struggle through understanding his work, right? And I felt that the reason I gave the subtitle to today's conversation of a reintroduction is because as I listen in to other podcasts on the left, to other leftists talking about philosophy or philosophers that inspire them or that they see as necessary, I don't hear Badiou's name as much as I want, right? That's my selfish plea for reintroducing Badiou. But to go back to your point, can you articulate that difference, perhaps?
Yeah,
I don't want to presume. I'll
no,
let you answer it.
Yeah, and I'm working through this also because I think that, of course, it's not like it's a kind of thought out thing. I think it's a tendency due to many factors, right? So, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert, and a lot of what I know from this is also from talking to you, but I do feel that I like to imagine that, and I don't think this is such a regional phenomenon. I think it's also a historical phenomenon, more in a temporal sense. I think that we went through a couple of waves of interpretation of Badiou's work that were caught up in other larger tendencies, right? So, for example, the 2000s is kind of the pinnacle of French theory, kind of its absorption by the states, right? And this kind of consolidation of kind of literature, the comparative literature departments as the place where you study continental philosophy, and a sort of consolidation of how to read all these guys as a kind of group of thinkers, right? And even so, there is this, which I would say was an important aspect of how Badiou arrived in the US and spread out in translations and engagements from there in many ways. There is the kind of maybe waves are too simplistic, but there are kind of a typology you can make, right? Like if you take like the French reception to his work, which is very bland, like you can see that the first wave of reception actually has the form, in my opinion, of his students. You can see a generation of students who were deeply influenced by him, from Tristan Garcia to Meillassoux and so on, even though they often try to disguise the influence to appear more original. You can backtrack it there. Then you have the kind of Lacanian absorption of his work, especially through Zizek, who I think sliced his work in a slightly different way and engaged deeply with the question of the subject, pretty much the question of the subject, and is Lacan and Badiou compatible? Are they compatible or not? And so on. Then you get this other kind of Deleuzian British interpretation, which you get like the Toscano, Nina Power, Feltham, Howard discussion, where there was a group of people interested in his work. They were less Lacanian kind of centered, more interested perhaps in the Marxism in him, the rationalism in him. He was put into dialogue with this kind of new rationalist
Brassier.
Yeah, Brassier. I would put like that's a separate thing.
Right.
Of course, there's engagements, but it's not like, the Chiesa, Zupancic.
Right.
I think there's a distinction there, right? So I'm mentioning these because I think these are like the serious people who really engaged with his work, which is different from like the blander way that just the absorption of French theory as a big block happened by just U.S. academia,
right?
So,
which is why under the rubric of comparative literature and French theory, his most popular books were kind of marginal books, like his ethics lecture.
Yeah, things like this.
Right. Or the St. Paul book.
Yeah. But I do think that there are two aspects in which there is a commonality, perhaps. I would separate also a third block, which navigated between these two, but it's a kind of separate one because maybe we can't divide it so clearly, but clearly in a certain sense, the Zizekian bloc was more interested in the questions of love and politics, but with a bigger emphasis on the subject and libidinal aspects and so on, right? This British, not British, but this other rationalist school was more interested in science, ontology, mathematics, and so on. But then there is a more scattered group of people who were interested in politics, like Bustillos, and who were Howard in a very deep sense as well, in Feltham. But there were strands that were like, I'm just mentioning this because they were slicing his project in different ways.
And then there's also the strand of people that were coming at Badiou more from a math science point of view.
Right? Yeah, that's what I mean. I think like
Luca Frazier.
I would put her together with Soutien and Brassier in a certain sense.
Yes.
Everyone moved around in many ways, but
true.
I do think that there was a tendency in this first international wave of responses to really slice his work and select a certain segment and then read deeply into that and downplay another. So Zizek had nothing to say about mathematics. Many of the more math-centered people had nothing to say about politics. People who wanted to discuss Badiou and poetry had nothing to say about something else. So usually there was a kind of decomposition of his work into smaller parts. And I think that nothing wrong about this, but this could be framed together with the French theory US reception as a sort of different effects of academia. Because academia needs to slice things to make them manageable into departments, into journals, into seminars, and so on. And it's just hard to fit the whole thing into any of those boxes. And so I'd say that in many ways, there was a long period where this kind of bigger overview, where you see certain problems and interests that only appear if you consider everything at once, wasn't really the core of any type of comment, And So I think that was a restrictive or perhaps just a necessary kind of first step in this kind of wave of comments, interpretations, and so on. Now, there is a second aspect, which I think is even deeper. Surely we could discuss more extensively the influence of a long period of depolitization and an overinflation of academic discourse. These things are definitely connected, right? So it's not for nothing that you get these kind of deflated readings, but also scattered readings or segmented readings at a time where, nobody's engaged in anything really, like, very much.
Well, hold on. I wonder if we neglected to mention the effort which coincided with global struggles and the kind of sequence, right, of because if Hart and Negri emerge in the late 90s as the kind of new post-Marxist wave of thinking anti-globalization struggles, it seems to me that Zizek emerges as a kind of countervailing critique of their tendency. Obviously, this begins roughly about the time of the economic crash of 2008, and the idea of communism lectures or conferences emerge. The communist hypothesis comes onto the scene, and Badiou becomes noted as the number one communist intellectual.
That's
for
what
many
I
years,
was gonna I was
right?
gonna mention as the kind of, because everything we described, it's prior to that moment, right? And I do think that I'm not sure about the Hart Negri versus Zizek thing. I think that there are, I don't know how I would account for that, but just leaving that aside, I do think that maybe it's the economic crisis, maybe it's other things, but the fact is that I think that the idea, Christopher just said here, like, people were fighting with Badiou earlier, and there were already, but I'll get to my point, which is not really that. Of course, Badiou's work was always explicitly communist, explicitly Marxist, was always there. Many other scholars were discussing communism, discussing Marxism, Hart and Negri amongst them, and many others. So that's not the point. I'm trying to be specific about Badiou's commentators, which in the commentaries, not the commentators themselves, but the waves of commentary, which I think are not necessarily aligned with all these bigger intellectual moves. I don't want to generalize too much here, but I do think that yes, you're right. There are also movements from his part to organize this conference with all these other guys. There was a resurgence of this explicit discussion of communism, and I'm sure that the economic crisis helped to bring the word back into discussion. But the thing that I wanted to mention is that it's not so much about the kind of circulation or discourse around radical political ideas, because I don't think that ever went away, and it's quite arguable that it got much overinflated even in academia. Or per academic discourse. Not really my point. My point is more that I think that the idea that that his philosophy, when he says it is conditioned by something which is not philosophical, that actually is a very important key to interpret his work, and not just another philosophical statement that you just put together with a bunch of other ideas, and you're just, the idea that's really key. And that
could I be annoying and ask you to sort of elaborate on this notion of the conditions
sure
in the event that folks are less familiar with
but it's an idea that Badiou makes more explicit around the 80s. It's already fully fleshed in being an event, but it's this proposition that You can find it actually in an interview he organizes with. It's like a short interview movie thing. You find it on YouTube in the 70s, where he's talking with Hippolyte and Foucault and all these guys, and at the end he has a chance to formulate his own position. It's already a bit in this direction. So it's an old idea, but in the 80s you get this very explicit formulation that philosophy doesn't produce any true statements. So you shouldn't assess philosophical propositions in the sense of are they true, are they false, because it's not referring directly to the world, but it's actually conditioned by things which are not philosophy, other practices which are not philosophy. And these non-philosophical practices are the ones who actually hold this deeper engagement with novelty, with thinking through, social, scientific, artistic, and amorous impasses and so on. And they actually are the place where truth gets worked out historically and so on. And philosophy actually comes after that, which is very Hegelian in many senses. And philosophers actually need to have deep intimacy with all these other things and a deeper recognition of the seriousness of what is thought out in these non-philosophical places, which is not necessarily very Hegelian. Hegel had a hard time allowing other things to think deeply other than philosophy. But he had this concession, right, Badiou, saying, look, real thinking happens outside of philosophy, but philosophers are interested in all these different manifestations of thinking, and they try to organize, systematize ways of making all of this compossible. So what is a statement that is not just profoundly influenced by the Russian Revolution, but not only keeps space open for new political ideas to appear, but also allows artistic ideas and scientific ideas not to necessarily be just the mere expression of politics, to have their own autonomy. That's a very, very high standard to put on what philosophy can say that is consistent, right? So, for example, I think that I'll get to this later, but I think that I can give you guys a good example of how you can arrive at some of Badiou's more complex formulations if you start from this very basic idea that philosophy is conditioned by something, and that something thinks, and it's pretty varied. And the task of saying something consistent about something that is not only varied in its presentations, but open to appear in ways that we yet don't know what it is a really high standard. And it puts a really, really complicated toll on how you strategize to systematize and talk about things in abstract, general ways, as philosophy does. So I have the impression that the way that conditions or the conditioning of philosophy in Badiou's work was absorbed by these earlier waves of commentary was as an invitation to divide his work. Well, if philosophy is conditioned by art, then let's hold a symposium on philosophy and art. Let's write a book on politics and philosophy, something like this. But none of the important philosophical decisions of his work stem from just one condition. They stem from the fact that you need to keep all of them in view all the time as a philosopher, right? And the other aspect of conditions, which is also disconcerting, is that philosophy is not thinking that much compared to what real practical engagement with things is capable of thinking. So if you want to know about political thought, you probably shouldn't be inviting philosophers to talk, which is something it's pretty obvious from the ground, that creativity is much closer to the ground of struggle and practice and so on. And a lot of the Badiou's value is to recognize that, and rather than to assume that he can already anticipate everything that will be interesting in all these fields and just spell it out, right?
It's very telling to me that a lot of people that read Badiou get immediately confused because religion is not one of the four, right? Religion is subsumed under love, right? And I suppose that is a claim having to do with advancements in the field of mathematics and in the field of set theory. And so there's also something like a historical foundation or grounding to the four and the decision of the four. I know that I think Zupančič has written about the fifth discourse. Obviously, Lacan has, and they're not called discourses because Badiou doesn't work in discourse theory, and I know that Gabriel has an allergy or a kind of frustration with the theory of the discourses in Lacan. But I guess I'm going to ask you that silly question of like, why is it four conditions? Could that be answered?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are many answers. I'm not sure we've done enough research to enrich this explanation in interesting ways. I think that most answers are pretty standard. I think that you need to start from, you can start from the inverse, which is, well, what is Badiou calling a field that warrants the name of a condition for philosophy? Is a field that can immanently pose its own problems, work out solutions to those problems by extracting new forms out of material reality, right? In a historically open way. He will call a thinking this movement of being able to historically, contextually, in a situated way, engage with what's going on, kind of push through the limits of where we are currently in that field, right? And bring out something new, which is not just a reiteration of something we knew before. And even the means to recognize that novelty are often part of what is new, right? I always love this formulation of his, that novelty sometimes is so new that we don't have the means to recognize it's new, right? It's not something that imposes itself on us. There is all this subtlety to it. So he spells out in very detail and with a brilliant way, a brilliant kind of approach to it, because, well, if you're onto a paradox, if you want to have a theory of the new, because if you can fully theorize what's the new, then you're saying it's not that new because you know beforehand what form it has. So a lot of the mathematics that he ultimately found relevant to his project is a very, very subtle result that's not even that important for most mathematicians, but it just does the job that he needs, which is sketch out the form of how something could be constructed without having a recipe for construction. So it's very hard to do that conceptually. Concepts, just like conceptual natural language, it goes too quickly into kind of determining what the hell they're talking about, which makes a lot of philosophers prefer the ineffable, right, as a kind of precaution. But there are other ways you can reach really refined heights of touching on these difficult ideas by stepping back into ineffability, but you can also move towards like constraining language. The more constrained languages are, which formal languages are very constrained, they're not very equivocal, you get sometimes to talk about that without equivocally talking about other things as well and over-determining them too much. So he posed to himself this problematic task of giving us a sense in which we can talk about the structure of new things without over-determining what they are. That's a very complicated project, right? So once we go in this direction and we have this idea that, well, conditions are just defined as these, whatever it is that has this basic structure of allowing something new to emerge, that will work out its own language, it will work out its own conditions for discernment and so on, and then try to find what are these things that people, not Badiou, but people who engage with these things already tell us that they are such a procedure. I don't think religion is like that. In fact, I mean, I think Badiou has a much more complicated relation to religion than a lot of commentators suggest, by simply equating him as if he's one of these thinkers that thinks modernity ended this transcendental regime and now religion is dead. Even though Badiou sometimes seems to be saying this when he says God is dead and the one is dead and these things are similar. A really good friend of mine who published a really good book on Badiou, who I think is one of the few representatives of this newer trend on Badiou commentaries, which is Reza Naderi. He's working on a book, and I read his last chapter. I think it's the first chapter of the book, but the latest thing he wrote, which is precisely on trying to show that there is actually a political dimension to religion that was worked out in history by many political events, sometimes positively, sometimes destructively. There is no kind of heavenly battle between materialist philosophy and religion, and you can just treat the whole of religious experience as this one thing that fits into a little box. I think that he's giving it a much more interesting treatment. You have religious experiences that are challenging in the level of love. You have religious experiences that are challenging on the science. It's not the same thing. Plus, religions are very different, and so on. I do think that in the more vulgar way, the problem with putting religion amongst the procedures is that, at least if we focus on Christian religion, is that there is only one. Every novelty confirms the same truth, right? The truth of a religious event. And so as a model for what Badiou is talking about, as conditions, as a kind of, does it fit what he's talking about? No, maybe it has some special place. Let's just come up with a different concept for it. Why try to fit it there? It doesn't kind of tick all the boxes for the condition. Now, but that doesn't answer your question. So why four? Badiou has said more than once. Maybe there are more, but it's not up to me to say this. It's up to whatever procedure it is to not only push forward, invent new things, but also name itself as a place of new things, right? And I think that there's an argument that Hegel makes in the Reasoning History text, that short snippet that circulates from Philosophy of History in the introduction, I think, right? Where he talks about fragmented history before he talks about philosophical history. And it's the before last form of historical form. And he talks about, well, why is there history of art, history of politics, or history of whatever? Because the very meaning of that field is part of what's being worked out in that history, right? As art moves on, it changes what art means. And it's funny because it's where Hegel sounds the most like what Badiou calls a procedure, I think. When he accounts for this kind of strange movement of the concept and history that's outside of philosophy, creates a plurality of fields where there is a reflective struggle going on, right? Neither Hegel nor Badiou would put a religion in that place, I think. And I don't think anyone with a religious experience would also do so, to say that the meaning of the religion is being worked out as people engage and live through that experience. It just sounds like a different thing. Now, I've tried, I think it was also very cheeky of trying this, but in that course, I presented like Marxism of Badiou. I suggested that if you look at the four basic components of the labor process in Marx chapter 7 or 8 of Capital, where you have kind of material to be worked through, like raw material, you have knowledge, you have labor power, you have products and production and so on, you kind of can map each procedure to one aspect of that formation, things that kind of make it dysfunctional, right? So, but I think it was a bit like, it was the only time I saw anyone trying to give a sort of historical materialist origin of why novelty works itself out in segmented ways in modernity rather than in some other way. But I'm not fully convinced of that explanation. It would be more deterministic than Badiou's own take, which is more agonistic, like I have nothing against there being more procedures. I just haven't seen people affirm that there are more than four. It's not about me, right? And I think Zupanchit's point about the fifth condition, it's she's absolutely brilliant as
Yeah.
always, but I do think it's a Lacanian thing to always be ahead of the curve, like,
Right.
you know. And I think it doesn't work. Badiou doesn't need that at all, I think.
Well, I guess one of the ways to help people conceptualize the four conditions is to also introduce um, the four subject positions or subject effects: the militant subject, the obscure subject, the reactionary subject, subject of resurrection. I mean, these from Logics of Worlds are extremely interesting to me. I've always been deeply fascinated by them. They kind of index a mode of relationality to the appearance of truth in a given world, right? And one of the interesting things that I would claim is like a maybe a presupposition of the introduction of truth to a given world is there's like an egalitarian dimension to it, or there's like something that it is for the all. It is a universal. And in a way, um, the militant subject has to, each subject has to sort of make a decision on the truth. And I'm wondering if you could speak to this for your own work, this idea of the militant subject, of the reactionary, of the obscure. For example, as a side point, I once wrote a long essay about the brilliance of this notion of the obscure subject as a kind of descriptor for fascism and for the return of fascist politics, because the obscure subject is kind of riddled at the level of their body through the introduction of a universal truth in the world, and they attempt to kind of pervert it by reintroducing alternative truth in its place, or sort of they cover it over in a certain way, right? So there's these certain operations, right, that designated subject, designated relations to the truth perform. And I'm wondering if you could maybe say a few things about that. How do you think that these propositions have aged well for Badiou? Do you think that they are like still very much at the foundation of his thought?
Yeah. So just a side comment, I just saw in the chat somebody disagreeing that Hegel would have put religion in that place, and I thinking now, yeah, I agree. Which is, I was trying to save Hegel, but yeah, maybe he would. But just yeah. So just to, I think that what you just mentioned is a really good example of this proposal for introducing Badiou is a good kind of test topic for it.
Right.
Because what is it that can get lost very quickly on this discussion? And I'm gonna note this further by the fact that if we are caught up here in this discussion under any sort of scholarly suture of Badiou's work, is probably the Lacanian one, where
Oh,
we
no
have
doubt.
a meaning of subject in our heads, right? Before we read his work, which is how Zizek read it and so on. And so from that perspective, which is slicing his work in a certain way, subject very rarely is not identified with a person. Like people make decisions, right? How can he have a theory of decision that is not about people deciding? And then, of course, as Lacanians will say, that presupposes a conscious subject. Doesn't matter if he said that it doesn't, but what does it mean to decide? And it sounds so Sartrean existentialist and so on. Well, if you undo that suture and you suddenly are obliged to think that the concept of subject for Badiou must cover things as different as a set of works for an artist who is engaged with a material and just seeing how the material responds and trying things out, and then create something else, no longer out of their minds, but trying to push forward something that they did in a previous work, or trying to study aspects of some other guy's work. and decisions need to apply to that context. They need to apply to how certain experiments are made in science and how to interpret those experiments. And political organizing gets much more complicated because he will repeatedly name this subjectivity in politics at the level of these organizations, not at the level of individual people. So there is no basis to say that the concept of subject in Badiou refers to people individually, right? Might it refer, not even in love it does, in fact, where it refers to couples. So it's very rare to find, like in Badiou's work, examples where, even though he didactically does so often, and I think it's deceptive, if you look at the actual more complex conceptual construction, in art, you have a weird partnerships between artists and things. In love, you have collectives between people, as in politics. And in science, people are almost erasing themselves so that formal statements can be partnering up amongst each other. So that already puts things in a very different light, because it's not really about people's dispositions and so on. So that there's no psychological or even analytic, in the psychoanalytic sense, not even an analytic conclusion to derive from his ideas, right? So, for example, Chris just mentioned here, a subject is that which unfolds consequences of an event. Yeah, but like, if every individual in a post-revolutionary society just worked out for themselves the consequences, there would be no political event, because it's a collective event, right? It's collective because people decide collectively, and collective decisions don't need to represent any individual's decision, right? If you've ever been to an assembly, you know the thrill of having a collective decision that is better than your own, because it was weirdly worked out by everyone, and it's no one's decision, right? That works out the consequences of politics, not you personally in your head or even in your immediate actions. So it's hard to place these questions in the right kind of field if you are too stuck in kind of slicing Badiou's work in these different ways. I think that really makes it hard, right?
Right.
So that's my first point.
I mean, it kind of makes me think, at least in the field of politics, you could perhaps draw an analogy to like the Peasant War in Germany by Friedrich Engels, where he says at the moment of Protestant Reformation, you had like three options: revolutionary religious mysticism and Munzer. The notion of kind of like moderate reformism, Luther, and then you had kind of preservation of status quo, right? In a certain way, maybe this is a way to think about it to some extent, because you also have the Gramscian notion of the conjuncture, right? And so, because our topic is Marxism, and I do want to push us to more focus on the political condition and also to understand Badiou's Marxism and so on, but maybe you could say something about this, right? Because I think you make a beautiful point, which is we should not understand this as some kind of humanist conception of truth, in which there's a theory of the subject of consciousness kind of making these rational decisions on truth. Truth, in fact, cuts the collective, and the decision comes from the position of an unknowable in a certain way. It comes from a position of impotence, he'll say often, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, this is okay. I want to push things in that direction that you're mentioning, because I don't think anything I'm saying, I think everything is a bit of a prolegomena, because to me, the best introduction to Badiou's work today is to be engaged with something which is not philosophy, and to be deeply engaged with many different things. If you do that, you will have questions that I will be hard pressed to find a better guy to discuss them with than this French fellow. That's the pitch I want to give you guys. Like, don't get to this Badiou by saying he's the best French guy who thought about the problem of the void of the signifier. That's not going to get you into the good stuff. That's where we're going to get. But the hard, I forget how you say this, like the thin line we need to cross is that, and Connor said it here in the chat very nicely, and you just mentioned that in a certain way as well, which is people who like psychoanalysis, it's a good thing, of course it is, that we're trained to have a tolerance for something which is not our intentions. But we're very intolerant to accept that there are many things which are not our intentions and remain free and a form of thought, which is not the unconscious that Freud thought about. There are things which are not conscious. They don't concern your individual life. They're not about your deep secret of your mother and your father and the real of your jouissance. They're just indifferent to that. They're about something else. Just let it go. And so it's good that we are prone to hear an argument that people as the masses think as a mass. Collectives can reach decisions that it's no one's particular decision. That artistic processes can bring up forms that they're never going to be exhausted by a psychological little examination of the artist. It's coming from somewhere else. And we follow the first part of that and saying, of course, alas, Freud has already prepared us for this. But the second part is harder for us, which is, dude, relax. It has nothing to do with this. Just leave it aside. There are very interesting analytic questions as to why people resist and are anxious in engaging with things that think but don't concern them. And I think we can do both sociological analytic studies about the anxiety of engaging with new things. And I think that the fact that new things don't concern us this much, they're not going to reveal a deep truth about us because they're not about us. It's a very worthy investigation on its own right. But I don't think it has anything to do with the unconscious. Which is sad for me because it would be great if it did. I could write many books and stuff, but it doesn't. And again, and I feel that to push my point further, and of course, people can say, but Badiou discussed Lacan often and so on. Definitely, and I think it's another interesting debate about how to parse out Badiou's work to separate the conceptual core, the didactic mechanism, the interlocutors that allowed him to reach certain ideas, and his own personal experience with the conditions, which also color this thing with the particularity. It's very hard to separate all these things, but they are separable. And at the core of what he's constructing, he's not relying on Lacan. It's its own thing, right? So my point is that this crazy idea I'm presenting, I think that the weird thing about it, and this is my segue to Marxism, the weird thing about it is that it is most obvious at the most vulgar level. This is most obvious if you have political engagement where you take seriously what is being worked through with your comrades, and you're not just applying books and throwing books at people's faces. If you are interested in art in any way that it's authentic for you, like it's not just for show, and you're that kind of bothers you, you want to understand what goes on when you make music and when you listen to music or whatever, or when you take seriously that your decisions as a couple or a tuple, depending on the relationship you have, that those things have a history of their own that's not reducible to your personal history or that of your lover, right? And so on and so forth. Or that science can really, take us to places we can't follow. That's really crazy. So I think that the more you're interested in these other things, the more the type of question you tend to have makes Badiou's work a native space for that, right? That to me is the first selling point of his work. Like that's the best way to get introduced into it, which is weirdly not to hype it up that much, right? not to confuse the disposition that he had to give these things the
Right.
upper hand with being excused from doing the same. You can't, after Badiou's, go around thinking you have a political theory for everything, right? Just because
Well,
he was the one not to think that, right? So that's, I think, it's a really important
but it
aspect.
also, knowing your argument in your book, The Desire of Psychoanalysis, it also separates a tendency which is maybe not intended by Lacan, but certainly is implemented by Lacanians, which is what you might call this kind of imperialist imposition on every field. Psychoanalysis supposes that it can become the master of that field or the host of that field, or teach the musicians something that they didn't know, or bring to politics, something which is why I felt in my debates with Lacanians at some point you have to say, well, Marx is more important at the end of the day than Lacan. So just so we're clear, because a lot of Lacanians have no problem putting Lacan in the driver's seat in all instances, right? And that is, maybe imperialism is too strong of a word, but there's a bit of that going on. And what you're saying is that Badiou gives us this completely different epistemological modality, which has a much more of like a humility
Yeah, I think,
structure to it, maybe in some way.
to be honest with you, I even have this now. This is the wild psychoanalysis part. I do think Badiou has such a giant ego because his philosophy doesn't. Like, he needs to compensate because he came up with a philosophical system that is the least controllable ever. Right? It's fully kind of, it's filled with, I was talking to Chris earlier today, like, it's filled with these holes for novelty, and it's fully constrained so that it doesn't try to anticipate what can be done by others. And there are many ways to change it, add things to it. Uh, it is pretty weak in that sense. So I wonder if that's not why the guy is also like, I'll just read things that have people quote me in, and so kind of focused on his own legacy, because it's not very cogent with narcissism of the philosopher, you know.
At the
But yeah,
level of
that's
the
just
system. At the level of the system, it's not. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. So I'm going to encourage a pivot now to, maybe, I don't know the best way to introduce this, but I wanted to go back to the maybe to the pre-theory of the subject, Badiou, or around that time. Obviously, there's a recent biography that I think is, and Chris can confirm this, I think it was recently translated into English, if I'm not mistaken, which gets into the early years, his experience in the Algerian anti-colonial movement, his experience as a young militant, and obviously Robert Bancardo and Brian Cook have a book. I don't know if that's out yet, on a series of interviews that they've conducted on Badiou's work running up to 68, all throughout the 60s, in organizing an organization of Marxist unity. Really, it was called the UCFML, which I think is, what is the acronym? It's something like the United, something like Marxist Leninists of France United, something roughly translated to that. And it was a Maoist effort, interested, I think, in establishing things like the Mass Line. They had militants all throughout the countryside that would basically do this work full time. So they're literally like up at dawn, going into factories and doing workers' inquiry, working closely with a very important philosopher militant by the name of Sylvain Lazarus, who's we're familiar with through Anthropology of the Name, a very, very fascinating work, which we can talk about. So that's a little snapshot of Badiou's work. He's known after 68, of course, as this uncompromised Maoist, the virtue of fidelity becomes this sort of incredible idea that actually is part of the reason why he becomes a celebrity in France, because he writes a book called The Meaning of Sarkozy, and this book becomes a bestseller, almost in part because Badiou is seen as the last of the 68ers who didn't abandon Marxism, right? And there's something pure about that, right? Then he has this text called Theory of the Subject, which is a crazy, crazy book. I want to invite you to say a few things about this early book. I know it's a deeply Lacanian text. I don't know how you feel about it. I have the sense that this is like a rite of passage for anyone that wants to read Badiou. I would recommend starting there, and frankly, especially if you're coming at Badiou with Marxist interest. Why did Badiou see Marxism at this time, late 60s, post 68, etc., as having to return to the question of the subject? Maybe that's a question for you. What's driving that desire? What is that about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm from the position that there is no big discontinuity in Badiou's work, uh, and by work I don't mean just his publications. I mean the type of questions that, if you're engaged in radical politics, I think the type of questions that raises, I think, are the same questions that motivate him to this day. I think that the way that I would kind of get to theory of the subject is that if you look a bit before this, what type of initial theoretical publications is Badiou producing, right? Sorry, let me just read the comment here. Yeah, but what type of text is he's producing? One of his first published texts to engage with a debate, besides like political texts that are just meant to circulate amongst militants, groups, and so on, it's the autonomy of the artistic process. I forgot how it's called, right? Which is an intervention in the sense of trying to kind of take a step back from the way Marxism, at least his comrades at the time, were approaching the relation between ideology and artistic creativity, artistic invention, and so on. And opening a bit the space for art to have its own thing, right? Then you get to the concept of model and to his discussions on mathematics, mathematical logic, and so on. And again, even though Marxism is there, it's also opening a space for the way modeling works in mathematics to be an autonomous thing inside a formal system that refers back to formal systems and not just to real social reality out there. It's again trying to create a breathing room for science, right? That is not negating Marxism, but is using Marxism to find this breathing room. So that's when I suggested that the title of this could be A Marxism Full of Ideas, is because the question behind all of this is, how do you create breathing room inside of Marxism for people to do things that are irreducible to, let's say, historical materialist analysis of a social conjuncture, right? And I think that when he goes at Lacan in Mark and Lac, and at Miller, but at Lacan as well, again, he's saying, dude, signifier, those stuff, fine, do it on your own time. Don't come tell me that accounts for everything else. Again, restricting and saying this is a crucial novelty for a given field, but separating things a bit, right? He's not a guy who's demarcating things for the sake of, no, things are in their little boxes, they shouldn't mix. It's not about that, but what is the point of view in which we can see these struggles at the same time as being struggles for producing something new in its own terms, but that nevertheless, the position that recognizes this is still aligned with basic Marxist premise. And when it comes to politics itself, this is very complicated. And I think that if we could say that somebody asked about Plato and Mao. If in a certain sense, Badiou elects Plato as the first guy who tried to recognize the autonomy and inherent interest and capacity of these different fields and place philosophy at the position of recognizing that difference between a dialogue on love, a dialogue on justice, and so on and so forth, Mao would be the person who would try to free up the problem of novelty from a certain understanding of historical determination, something like this. So it would be the one of the great Marxist thinkers, one of the great communist thinkers, who would put the place of subjectivity in a higher standard than others, right? And there are very good reasons to do this, and we can go deeper into how we might understand this in Mao. But if you just take like snippets of his thought, like I don't know, the text on the against the worship of books, right, which is praising investigative subjectivity as the thing that should really carry forward the organization of party and mass politics, rather than hierarchies that might be sometimes very well defined by what we know about social conditions, right, and from other struggles and so on. So generally speaking, even before Theory of the Subject, we already see Badiou dipping his foot in all these debates, and always with this idea that there is a very complicated task of increasing the autonomy of fields, right? Increasing the autonomy of fields, while at the same time not disentangling them completely. Clearly, there is something that works itself out in many places. But there is, in the same way that you mentioned, this analytic tendency to elect your own field because it has some dealings with truth as the surveyor of every other form of novelty. Marxism can easily fall into that position where because it has dealings with political truth, then we can evaluate everything on that criteria, right? Early on, I thought that there was a good didactic kind of apparatus to introduce this problem in a kind of very neatly philosophical issue, because a lot of people think ideas are to be opposed to something real, like the ideal and the real, right? But there is another much more useful distinction, in which I think is the one that Badiou is actually employing, which is the distinction between an idea and an ideal. Just think very vulgarly about ideas. Let's say you have a broken air conditioning. You have an idea on how to fix it. What does that mean? That doesn't mean you have a recipe. That means you're put into movement, into trying a certain path and see what happens, right? I have an idea. And people say, what is it? Sometimes you can't even say it, right? An ideal is something more like a preliminary plan or recipe that then you're going to apply and judge things based on that plan. An idea is more of a strategy for tackling something that still is open to seeing how things will respond to you, and then you try again, and so on and so forth. It's almost like ideas are more pragmatic and ideals are more normative in that sense, right? That distinction, I think it's a much better way to approach why Badiou is the way he is. And then this is my little proposal if you accept that distinction. Say there is just one idea in one field. The idea of, with the support of peasants, urban workers taking on a kind of mixed Tsarist system and doing the October Revolution, right? And the way that the Bolsheviks work, that's the political idea of modernity, right? Well,
the dictatorship of the working class and the peasantry.
Yeah, if you say that that's what
like
was going on there,
like
okay,
slogan,
sure, yeah. All power to the Soviets, whatever. Now we're in the 50s, 60s in Colombia, and that idea has become an ideal, because if we're going to repeat it, now we have a plan. So there are no, if there is only one idea, there are only ideals once it happened. If there is, let's say we accept that there are many political ideas. The October Revolution is tactically and strategically and in all senses of the word different from the Paris Commune, which is different from the Mexican Commune, and so on. Well, but then when I'm doing music, I'm just composing some song, I should probably measure what I'm doing by its connection to revolutionary ideas in politics. And now revolutionary ideas have become ideals in art. So if there is only one procedure with ideas, then there are ideals everywhere else. So there is a necessity for a theory of ideas to be multiple, both in terms of the fields and in terms of history. If you abide to ideas, people have ideas, and ideas can open up to something new that's kind of unprecedented, and we kind of try how it's going to go. Then you need to commit to multiplicity of procedures and sequences. You can't have one without the other. If you have one without the other, you have a theory of ideals for everything else. Just think what Lenin would do and then compose a trap song. That's not going to work, you know? Maybe it does, I don't know. But you know my point. So again, that's not a way to introduce yourself to Badiou's ideas or his approach that requires you to, you know, engage too much with philosophy first. It's actually a way to approach philosophy with this problem. What could it be to have a theory of multiple ideas? And I think that will explain why Plato is relevant, will help understand why there's something about Mao that sounds like he, by coming as at the end of a certain sequence of political developments and so on, certain problems might have been a bit clearer there than in other places. But that's not really the core of it. I don't think you need to like Plato or like Mao Zedong to appreciate these things, right?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a nice essay translated in The Adventure of French Philosophy, which is paraphrasing the title, something like On the Current Philosophical Political Front in France. And it's a kind of diagram of the predominant tendencies of the radical left and where Marxist-Leninism fits, where Stalinism fits, where like bourgeois leftism fits, Deleuze and Guattari are mapped onto that, and so on. And one of the early claims in this period of theory of the subject, of course, is that there's something vital that both Mao and Lacan are offering to Marxism, and he's working with this dialectical notion of scission of the one divides into two, and he's trying to sort of reconceptualize a Lacanian theory of dialectical materialism. And at the same time, he's also a student in some way of Althusser. He had a text around this time where he's criticizing Althusser's theory of contradiction, really coming at it from a Maoist point of view, claiming that Althusser is neglecting the autonomous power of the masses in his conception of contradiction. In some sense, he's kind of accusing Althusser of being a little too Stalinist, even though I think Althusser is trying to expunge that kind of mechanistic dimension of Stalinism as much as possible. So my question is sort of, if you could speak a little bit to that theory of the subject period. I know full well you say that there's a continuity, and I love your point, and I'm growing to abandon my view that was very influenced by like Bruno Bostiels, who I think disagrees with that argument. Right? I'm coming more to your perspective, but at the same time, I want to tether with this moment.
Let's get to it.
Crisis of Marxism, because the crisis of Marxism is not fully entered into its full crisis period, which we'll get to with Being an Event and the kind of early 80s, right? But here we are in the 70s. Why Lacan and Mao, and what is this fusion doing? And how is he maybe yeah, thinking the dialectical materialism.
Yeah. So, like, one thing that I've come to think in time, just by looking back at, like, I don't know, I I think I wasn't conscious of this, but I just look back at things I tried to write earlier and so on. I was so deeply engaged with Hegelian, Lacanian stuff, and in time you see that you can keep drilling at the same questions and being interested in the same things, and you can actually really kind of switch away from having authors debate them for you. And I think that that's why am I saying this? Because uh, it is there is a conjunctural aspect to certain things that might look, when you just make them into a book, like a final necessary thing. But uh, if you think about that context and who Lacan was in that context and what Mao meant to European thinking, not only France, but Portugal, Italy, and so on at that time, it's hard to imagine that you would be able to work out certain ideas, if not in that way. I'm sure it's not an instrumental way, because I'm sure he was deeply trained in that way of thinking. But we have the benefit of looking back and saying, okay, that's the language of the game. But what are the moves he's making? That's what matters, right? That's where we'll get the style of that player. And I think that there is that I think, but you to understand theory of the subject, I think you need to, in my opinion today, you need to really imagine a guy that spent 5 years, which are kind of reported back in the book of the poor peasants, Le Livre des Paysans Pauvres, which is a publication we have now. It's actually available online, if I'm not mistaken. One of the few things in French that you can find a PDF for, about what he was doing in the 70s when they continued doing workers' inquiries in suburbs in France. If you're not interested in the theory of inquiries, and if you're not interested in the difference between the theory of workers' inquiries in Europe and in third world countries, I think it's very hard to understand what is the core of the political experience of that moment. And workers' inquiry in general, not only the Chinese or Latin American variant, but even the Italian variant, the French variant of socialism and Barbère, which was taken from the Forrester tendency, right? From the States. I mean, there's a very interesting history of that. I know Assad Haider wrote a really good text on this. But the basic idea on this is that you can take this up because you no longer trust other forms of mediation. So, for example, it's usually ultra Trotsky tendencies that don't trust either state or certain types of political mediation to truly bring out what is the thought of the workers, and believe that these mediations misrepresent this and can just absorb this back into a sort of authoritarian state. More councilist communists, as Jasper Barnes has shown in his latest book, due to slightly different perspective that's not Trotskyism, might also find in that sort of way of engaging with the question of what are people thinking, what are the problems that they think is the important problems, how are they thinking about dealing with this, and how can we mediate, at least facilitate the process of pairing with these questions, the workers pairing with their own questions in their own terms, right? That the deepness of that experience, and imagine taking 5 years of your life to do workers' inquiry in other cities with the idea that you can't propose a new type of party if you don't spend that long listening to people and talking to them.
Right. But also, it was also tied into an insurrectionary strategy of geographical disbursement of militants at particular factories, with the possibility of coordinating a nationwide strikes. And so they would learn, like, things would work, they wouldn't work, they would fail, they would go to prison. And one of the most successful interventions was this rent strike. And I did a podcast on this with Robert and Brian, which was in, I think it was across France, that the UCFML coordinated. But in each instance, it's all about revolutionary agitation, right?
Sure, but I
Right?
think
It's essential.
agitation is not a term that you find so often in many of these autonomist circles discussing inquiries, because the inquiry is a form of its own. It's not just a means for agitation. It is a I mean, I don't want to go too much into this. I think it's a very, very interesting topic, but I just want to highlight that you have two tendencies for inquiries being discussed at this time in Europe. You have one that is basing itself on the Marx inquiries of that the Italians recuperated, that C.L.R. James was discussing and finding problems with and trying to correct them and so on. And you have the Chinese one, which is not following from Marx. It's something different. And part of the reason why the Chinese is different is because the social composition in China was so complex that you weren't just trying to give voice to a subject who you know to be there. You're trying to find out what the fuck is going on, right? Like the Hunan investigations that Mao did. It's not just let's try to agitate the workers so that they put something into motion. Is we don't know even what a subject is in this situation, and we need to investigate because we don't know. We don't know what are the problems. We don't know anything, and those are not exactly the same, because one has a slightly predisposition to identify the form that subjectivity, revolutionary subjectivity, will take. The other has one step before that, and he wants to find out something about forms and not just about energy, political energy, and how to direct, right? I don't want to be too simplistic, because this is like one of the greatest Marxist histories of the 20th century, the history of this idea, I think. But it's very telling to see that when Badiou is trying to formalize something about what does it mean to trust the masses, what does it mean to keep on going with the idea that the masses make history and therefore have a capacity to produce historical scansions and so on, that he will find an ally in psychoanalysis, even though he was criticizing it like a couple of years, 10 years ago, right? Because he picks up on the idea of a mediation that doesn't necessarily is interested in giving form to whoever you're listening to, but actually wants to see is ready to see what form appears from there. I do think that the question, I think somebody in one of the questions raised this, like, but you ask who did the Mao of psychoanalysis, right? I think that question has a bit to do with this problem. Like, what is an approach to psychoanalysis that can take a similar position with regards to subjectivity as the theory of investigation takes with political subjectivity, which takes this extra step back and tries to sort out the problem of what? Workers' autonomy, political subjectivity, and its autonomy to pose its own problems and solve its own problems, even if it doesn't fit into what we wanted it to fit. You know, we come with, I mean, I always loved Rancière's little scene that he describes, I think it's in The Philosopher and His Poor, when he talks about French revolutionaries meeting French artisans who were organizing and being disappointed because they didn't meet the criteria for what they thought the revolutionary subjectivity was. They were too autonomous. And then he said, the problem is not that they weren't revolutionary. The problem is that they were too communist. They were already doing their own thing, and that was disappointing. I think that this idea is a way to approach that issue, which is, if you read like Linhart on the Russian Revolution, you will see the same issue with Bolsheviks having to deal with peasant subjectivity and feeling disgust, right? So I think it's very interesting to approach the Mao-Lacan proposal from that perspective, but also treat it as a bit more of a conjunctural thing than... It's a French guy who only quotes French people, guys. Like Mao he treats Mao as a French person. He's the only non-French person that Badiou quotes. Let's not forget that. Like all poets, all psychoanalysts, all artists, everything, French Revolution, Paris Commune, he only quotes French things, right? Try to remember, I mean, Wallace Stevens is an exception and Emily Dickinson, but Generally, it's pretty close to home, like Victor Hugo or whatever.
Pessoa. Yeah.
Yeah, but he was in love, with the Pessoa scholar. But yeah, it's Monsieur Mao. It's Mao, right? It's the French. There is clearly a predilection for French. I even think that you can treat that more as a, yeah. If you want to intervene in your context, you better quote your your reference. Like,
Well,
and of course he
yeah.
mentions other things. Chris is always protecting, but you like, dude, don't worry. I like
Haitian
something very.
Revolution. Thank you.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's not a detailed example in any of the big books, and it's still pretty much against the French. So I guess it's pretty close to home
But I guess,
anyway.
what you're saying is that
Yeah, I
if
just
you,
want to highlight the conjunctural aspect of
yeah,
some of these references. So we focus on something else a bit more.
yeah, yeah,
What is the political problem in theory of the subject that is relevant regardless of if Lacan is the main interlocutor or whatever, right? I think that's the core thing. And then, of course, we can go into the readings and so on. That's all very interesting. And but I do think that that's what you get at that moment is the problem of conceiving of an idea of subject that is yeah, true. Trump is an exception. Mao Zedong and Trump, but like I think that he was trying to find a way to approach this problem of capacity for novelty, capacity for subjectivity, that he recognized in psychoanalysis, probably in Lacanian analysis, one of the greatest attempts at situating this problem, but also with certain limits, which I think he was right to identify. I don't think it's I don't think it's a Lacanian book, Theory of the Subject. I think it's a book with a great interlocution with Lacan and Hegel, but I think it's already something else. But it's kind of the first systematic effort in from this dispersed initial period that I was talking about, right? And in a certain way, it's almost like he left the problem of politics. Okay, think you discuss the autonomy of art, the autonomy of love, the autonomy of science. Now do it with politics, which motivated this whole process. So it's a much bigger task, and that's kind of the core of that idea. Find me a structural and a dynamic, historical, and ethical description of autonomy of political subjectivity that is rational. I think that's what that book is trying to address.
mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. There's a big debate we're having on the Marxist left today about the legacy of what's called the merger thesis from Kautsky, of the relationship that Marxists should cut between the union of intellectuals and workers. How is this to go? And I feel that Maoism, for all of its points of criticism one could raise against it, perhaps it does have like the most egalitarian solution to something like the merger thesis, which is this found through this notion of workers' inquiry, in which there's not some imposition of the intellectual per se, right? There's a kind of opening of a space. And when I did an interview with Badiou many years ago, during the Arab Spring, I asked him to define the militant subject in our time. And to paraphrase, he basically said that the militant subject is an organizer of other subject positions that creates this sort of space of, and here's a new term, of compossibility between those subject positions, right? And I felt that as the political situation deteriorates and the class composition of the question of the revolutionary agent deteriorates, which is a big debate we can get to in a moment, because, of course, Zizek recently criticized Badiou for abandoning the working class as the revolutionary agent, which is something I want to raise. But as that's happening, whether we agree with that sociological claim or not, Badiou is, or what is Badiou doing? He's still doing workers' inquiries, but now, like, the meaning of the worker has to adapt. It has
Yeah,
to enlarge. It has to
I
enlarge. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a very important point, and I would love to talk to Robert and other people who are much more knowledgeable than me on this, because my intuition is that Badiou only becomes a what I would call a Maoist, not in the how we call LARPing sense of, but the actual sense, in the 80s, after it was cool to be a Maoist. Why? Because I think that when France imported terms from the Cultural Revolution, most militants didn't do because they had similar problems at the Cultural Revolution, as Chinese revolutionary thinking had since the beginning of the century, which are very third world problems, which is colonial presence totally deforms the modernization process.
It's a completely
Creates,
different mode of production. It's a completely
yeah,
different issue
exactly.
of
So
power. And yeah.
that creates a problem for the unity of this form we call the worker, the modern worker.
I was
And
talking to a Kluskard, Michel Kluskard disciple, and they're like, yes, Badiou, we call him a French Maoist. He did not do the Long March. It's kind of like what you're saying,
no,
but I
no, no,
love
yeah,
your point though that in the 80s, actually, no, actually now he is actually more
yeah,
rigorously Maoist. Yeah,
yeah. I think that the moment that he writes in that Can Politics Be Thought, when he presents this to people and says there is a crisis in Marxism, there is a crisis of the reference of Marxism, not a crisis of the theory. It's a crisis of what we used to refer to. And he says, look, certain figures are not going to present themselves anymore in the ways that we are accustomed to, and that we build strategies, analytic tools to identify. At that point, the theory you need to follow through with that assessment, that's when you become more like third worldist Marxists, having to deal with the crazy mess that capital didn't organize for you so that you could politicize further later on. For me, that's really where I would recognize, beyond like dressing like people, speaking like people, which is an ideal. That's when he has a Maoist idea. And you can see the trajectory of his militancy in the 80s with Organisation Politique and all these things, which remain with the idea of investigations. I tend to separate workers' inquiry from kind of this investigative procedures, because, just to separate the two traditions a bit. And I think Badiou is much closer to the investigative tradition than the workers' inquiry in the European sense. But I think that this is this is where it's from this perspective that some of his weird. I mean, how did this guy who used to, have all this history we're talking about, how does he come to the conclusion that for today we need Plato, right? Yeah, there sounds like a break, right? But I think that something that you could already see, I mean, discussions about Cohen, about category theory, all these things are there in the 60s. He was the first guy to mention that Cohen had developed the forcing technique before mathematical textbooks in France. He mentions the development of category theory in the first text he ever published. So it's not like the engagement with mathematics. It's not these type of things. I do think that there is that he comes up with this way of framing the problem of we know less than we thought. And if we want to keep what we do know is that whatever is out there, we should stick with the capacity for self-determination of people and build forms and assessments out of that capacity. I think that never ever changed. And I think that saying people are capable of things which are compossible but not the same is a deepening of that same commitment. Right? So that's the only rational explanation that I see to why move to the place that he did. Why start talking about these conditions? Because if you think that people think, if you think people come up with solutions to their problems, if you think people have this capacity for invention in this deep level, if they're capable of ideas, then there must be multiple ideas. And now you have a big problem in your hands. Not only do you need a theory of novelty, but you need to theorize about these things in a way that keeps the space for this open. So you need to be rational without overly determining, without being prescriptive, right? This sets deep challenges. So I propose this didactic proposal with ideas and ideals. My second proposal to show how this is useful, I think I've tried this out with you before, Daniel, but it would be to say something like this. Let's say we are deeply committed to people's capacity to produce, not only new art, but to change what art is. And we recognize that in our time, people have come up with art production, which is not even an object anymore. Art can be a performance, art can be a relation. Objects are not essential. You can have things which are not objects, right? So we can't generalize the notion of object anymore, because we know that their being cannot be objects. Because art, if people really can change what objects are this much, right? We don't want to prescribe. We can't have a general theory that puts objects as a necessary entity, right? If we accept that in our time, people have spoken about their histories, their personal upbringings, their love lives, to the point that it is possible to recognize that you can be in love and not form a couple that is a one, right? There is such a thing as being a set, like a couple which is irreducible to one, and it's not two people separately, neither. And that, in a certain sense, in that situation, you're not fully one yourself. Then you also cannot have the one as a starting point for your general theory, because people's capacity for love questions that and shows that that's a historically changing notion as well. Objects are historically changing. Oneness is historically changing. Science is constantly threatening what we call sense, right? Even what you could call like sophists or anti-philosophers like Wittgenstein are constantly showing, look, science doesn't need to make sense. So historically, science will take something we think it's substantial, grounding, harmonious, that makes sense to us as an explanation, and say, no, the explanation requires a space to be curved in more dimensions than you can actually intuit with your head. So we cannot have sense as a fundamental notion of a general theory either. So neither oneness, sense, objecthood, and then politics. You just start with Marx, where he's constantly telling you that the material conditions for existence are historically changeable. So even existing cannot be the general theory, because what exists and how it exists changes historically as well. So if you want to keep open for history for people to change to their thought and actions, what is sense? What is objecthood? What is oneness? And what is existence? A general theory of these things a general theory, an ontology, cannot make sense, cannot be one, cannot prescribe existence, and cannot be based on objects. Try to find anything other than this shelved kind of old part of mathematics called axiomatic set theory that lives up to these conditions. It's very hard. That's a pragmatic reason to use set theory to do ontology. Because when you talk about sets, you're not prescribing the one, have no commitment to sense. You're not saying that anything exists other than the void and the infinity, right? And they don't correspond to object. There's no objecthood implied. So that lives up to those conditions. But that explanation we just gave starts from a motivation, which is people have the capacity to invent things and to invent them in multiple ways. If you just assume this, you're hard-pressed to find a way to speak about being or whatever that lives up to these conditions. And you have a hidden condition, which is you need to do it in such a way that still is weak enough for new things to emerge. And set theory is weak just in the right way as well, right? So that's a way of understanding why you get to the complicated stuff of being an event, not because he changed routes, but because he deepened the commitment that you find in like a peasant investigation in the interior of France. It's from the same, you can find a continuity there, right? So,
Yeah, that's miraculous. Thank you for that. I mean, in a way, it's both inviting as much as it is intimidating to grasp the system, and we, I think, are at a good point to now introduce why being an event and the kind of importance of its intervention. But at around the same time, there's this other text called "Can Politics Be Thought," which is, I think, really the origin of the first significant reinterrogation into the core, which my kind of like conceptual architecture of really existing Marxism at the time. And of course, I feel that as a committed Marxist myself, there's the obvious problem, which is like Badiou is, on the one hand, maintaining a structural core of Marxism, which he nicely breaks down between, you know, the kind of what he identifies as the sort of three pillars of Marxism, which have their foundation in political economy, England, philosophical core, German idealism, and France, meaning the political core of Marxism, which is a notion that he gets ultimately from Lenin. Now, but at the same time, he says that Marxism is not reducible to one of these three. It kind of has to be thought all three. Now, one of the most important ideas of his intervention here, apropos Marxism, is this idea that we lose the referent. And one of the struggles that I've had, I'm going to invite you to say something about this struggle. Maybe it's not so much of a struggle for you, is the primacy that Marxism places on class struggle and the loss of the referent of the proletariat as grounded in and embedded in social class. This is a common move that's happening in post-structuralist philosophy. It's not just Badiou, right? Third world Marxism already has an imminent critical eye to the working class in the core regions. Sometimes this is invoked through a theory of labor aristocracy, for example. Some have argued that Badiou has a kind of latent theory of labor aristocracy. So, like, some Marxists criticize him accordingly. I myself, like, if you read Isabel Garro, Chris will be bothered that I'm always loving Isabel Garro.
yeah, more on Chris' side here.
Yeah. You're more on whose side?
Chris.
Yeah. Well, you'll have to kind of convince me, because you see, this is my one dangerous area with Badiou, is where does social class go when we think proletariat in the precise way that he's thinking proletariat, which in a way is a very classical, I mean, he's very fond of saying that the way we think of proletariat must be indexed to Communist Manifesto and the kind of utterance, the proletarian utterance or demand, the speech of, yeah, we are nothing, make us all, a kind of this kind of idea. So the proletariat doesn't name the empirical working class, not by any means. The proletariat's not the militant subject. It's not even necessarily the masses. It's not a fixed class in Badiou's vision. So, can you kind of assuage my anxiety regarding this? I don't want to say abandonment of class, but I mean, if Ellen Maskin Wood was aware of Badiou in her seminal book, you know, The Abandonment of Class and Marxism, and right, post-Marxism, right, she would criticize him. Vivek Chibber criticizes, many Marxists criticize him for this move. how do we sort of preserve, because at the same time when you read Badiou on class, it's not like he's running away from class. He's not like a liberal on class. Do you know what I'm saying? He's not saying, oh yeah, Marxism no longer needs the theory of class struggle. He's not saying that. I recognize that. But my challenge is like, but why can't we have a social determination of a class agency? I'll stop.
Yeah, so I'll just split my answer into two parts, three parts, in fact. I think that when we start having this conversation, given what I just said about ideas and ideals, about philosophy being conditioned, and so on, the first thing we need to conclude is that there is a skeleton for his project that is there to allow novelties to be taken seriously, be taken as the place of thought, and ultimately to revise philosophy, right? Because philosophy is then conditioned by these things. So we are allowed to ask about the specific conditioning of how Badiou puts meat into that skeleton, so to speak, given his personal commitments. Some people are Maoists, some people are Trotskyists, some people are working for national liberation, some people are indigenous peoples working against direct extermination. Like, there are many, many ways to engage with things, and they are not reducible to one another. And the guy's a genius for finding some basic structure that allows to take all of them seriously and recognize some features in all of them. But he took certain decisions and committed to certain things, and that colors his opinions on politics in general. But they are opinions. Very well informed opinions most of the time compared to many other people, but that's what it is. So I'll separate those things so that we don't take some of his personal statements based on what he knows and has seen, and he's trying to contribute to a conversation, with what follows directly from this conceptual and formal skeleton of his project, which you can buy without buying his personal positions on certain things, right? So that's the first point. My second point is, I think that I would propose a totally different reading of what you just said regarding the reference, because Badiou is absolutely distinct from post-structuralist French thinkers on that point. And that's why he made that specific intervention that you mentioned at the Lefort Derrida seminar. His whole point is that there is a profound distinction between saying that our political toolkit cannot reach the current reference because we are lagging behind, and saying there are no reference, everything is discourse, everything is fluid, and so on. That's, I'd say a lot of post-structuralists go in that direction. Badiou is going in the inverse direction. And in fact, the argument that political thinking degenerates into mere phraseology once it loses the capacity to latch on to its political reference, it's Marx's argument in German ideology. It's called German misery. So it's a classic Marxist argument. There's no post-structuralist blah, blah, blah about it. But it's done in the exact way to intervene in that context. And being an event is a theory of reference. A situation is not a discourse. A situation is a referent. A state of the situation is a representation of something. It's a theory of how to recognize and work with current reference, whatever they are. So absolutely not. Badiou is if that's what it post-structuralist is, which is, I don't know if people would agree, but if that's the case, that this kind of acknowledging that all we have are signifiers, and when we try to reach things, we're always fantasizing, or it's contextual or relative, whatever. I don't see any of that. That's a relevant discussion for Badiou. The statement, there is a crisis in Marxism, is a critique of Marxists, not a statement about the world now has no reference, right? That's how academics of the post-structuralist kind tell themselves that they are right. I mean, it's okay that we don't know what we're talking about. Nobody knows what they're talking about. That's really not his position, I would say. Now, the third part of the answer regarding class, I think that there is a double issue there, And I think we've discussed it privately. We had this conversation often. And I do see the vertigo in Badiou's proposition, which is to say, the critique of political economy is an instrument of working class struggle, meaning concepts are as useful and true as they are part of struggles. If you can't use it in struggle, and if it's not born out of struggle, it's not, there's no reason to keep it. The vertigo is, well, then are we going to lose the concept of class if we include it in the toolkit of people's autonomy to think through their situation? Yes, you might lose it. You might be like the French revolutionaries who find the French artisans and say, you guys are not talking about class, and you are disappointed at them, right? But that's not the case. We'll talk about class, right? And if you are in Badiou's position, you will therefore recognize that this remains a crucial concept, right? So that's the first part. I think that there is a vertigo in this displacement. And why is it a vertigo? Because as we lose the referent, as we lose the capacity to latch on to real political processes, we become more and more desperate for the sociological indexing of where to look at and how to evaluate discourses as being meaningful. And talking about class is meaningful as a discourse. Not talking about it is not meaningful. But can you use the concept of class to work out a decision in a political process, right? Some processes will use, some won't. And you need to be able to think through both of them without thinking that just because they're not talking the language you wanted them to talk, therefore, that's a problem. So I think that that's part of the answer, like, which is a weird way of politicizing Marx, where it's not just saying he's not just the father of sociology and blah, blah, blah. It's about class struggles, about revolution. Is also saying, because it's about revolution and about the production of mass political autonomy, even the theory of this process is part of the historical unfolding of political subjectivity. It's not like we have a theory of structure that we can safeguard, and then whatever happens, we can judge based on that theory. And I think that some people think that you cannot be a Marxist if you make that move. That vertical is the feeling of no longer being a Marxist, right? Negri will say he's just a communist, not a Marxist, something like this, right? So I don't think that's the case with him. And I do think that I would first criticize some of the uses of class that have deep explanatory power from my chair, but are totally disconnected with the reference of how people are dealing with class today within different political processes. I would start with those processes and then see what concept of class captures that thinking. Now, I do have a proposal on how these things work out within a Badiouian framework. If to be very kind of direct to the point, and just with a first side note, right? If you know what Badiou calls a site, and this idea that, for example, capital subsumes the worker by counting just labor power, but simply not counting it, just all other references, all other dimensions of life, including the reproduction of the worker, simply don't exist for capital. If you know that distinction, the idea of this threshold, right? We can use it to define the four concepts. Class is how workers are seen from the perspective of capital. Proletarian is how workers are not seen from the perspective of capital. Masses is how this inexistent thing comes to the fore without a form. And the people is how masses acquire a form that they build for themselves. You get the four concepts. It fits Badiou's system perfectly. Like, if that's what you're looking for, right? That's not the problem. But what Badiou teaches you to do is to look for the moment where ideas become ideals. And my problem is, are we sure that in a lot of this class conversation, are we just looking for political ideals to navigate a situation where we are without reference and we don't want to investigate? That's
Yeah,
my counter proposal.
okay, no, beautiful. Thank you so much. I suppose we butt up against the legacy of the, the idea that um, what is often under debate, right, in contemporary Marxism, especially in the wake of French theory, I believe, and post-structuralism, is this notion of replacement proletarian theories, which some Marxists feel constitutes a breach from a basic structural understanding of capitalist exploitation and priorities of organization that would be capable of leveraging truly novel militant activity that would be right, which
Can
that
you
is
give me
reliant upon a,
some examples of what you're talking about, just so it feels too broad? Like, what,
yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things about the post 1980s workers inquiry shift is the notion that there seems to be a fundamental kind of contingency, perhaps, of thinking about where radical activity or militant activity could come from that is detethered from labor necessarily. I've seen many Marxists seem to criticize Badiou on this point, whereby you have kind of like, and this is concurrent, by the way, to the idea of the period of the 60s, is what they call the new social movements. The question of 68 was not only for Badiou, I think it was about the unity of the students and the workers. But many people concluded after 68 that actually the workers were the ones that stopped 68. The workers therefore have a problem with cultural reactionary attitudes. And that enters into this huge debate regarding the kind of fixity, the kind of lumpenization of the working class, becomes a question of their passivity and lack of militant activation, becomes a struggle, because then we have defined militancy as detethered from class determination in the last instance. And that becomes a problem for, well, does it become a problem? For who is that a problem? That's my question.
and which working class are they talking about? I mean, I think that, for just a short side note as well here, the fact that I think Badiou takes Maoist investigations very seriously, I don't think should reflect on the idea that there is therefore, if you're a Badiou, and there is a correct political line you should take, because there is absolutely no minimally radical process which is not informed by what people engaged in it think and find out. So, I mean, it's just a very neat way to discuss putting forward people's practical engagement with the world uh, in a central position for thinking politics. But it's not, just to make that clear, because otherwise it might seem like other forms of politics make no sense, even though Badiou might, as I said, it's his personal opinion, make a choice there, but that's not what I'm saying, right? But for my argument to answer to you, this is an important side note to make, because
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's another more theoretical point to make, but I think that a lot of these discussions on, first, 99% of people discussing Badiou and placing him in this or that column read like the meaning of Sarkozy and then dislike
Sure.
him or cherry
Sure.
pick stuff. I mean, so that I don't know what to do with that. Like, fine, you can do that if you want.
I'll give you a concrete example. The text from your Brazilian comrade, neither vertical nor horizontal, opens with an appeal in alignment with Badiou's theory that no longer is the revolutionary subject tethered to a transitive conception of class as found within social structure, which is something that he got from an interview with Alberto Toscano. And your comrade, remind me of his name. He's a wonderful scholar. The neither vertical nor horizontal.
Rodrigo Nunes.
Rodrigo follows this through and then concludes ultimately that, yeah, that's true, what the task of militant organization must entail is to organize subjectivities, like beyond just that kind of immediate determination. And that has then led to follow-up debates over this question of class abstractionism. You can see my interview with Michael McCarthy about that. McCarthy kind of agrees with Rodrigo. Figures like from Damage Magazine, Ben Burgess, who else? Catherine Liu, Vivek Chibber, that camp of Marxists strongly disagree. So the question then revolves around like this question of how we examine the determination of subjectivity and social structure in class.
No, I understand. So
I
mean, just to be clear here, and I think that Rodrigo has an argument based on Badiou's claims regarding the problem with the assumption of transitivity that he takes in a certain direction. The book is called Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal. It's a really good book. I recommend it, as somebody asked here on the chat. But let's go back to Badiou directly, right? And I think that the core of that argument shouldn't simply be, I did this social analysis of the working class today, and there is no transitivity. There is no transcendental guarantee that if you pick this part of society, that its actions will reflect on the global of society. That's what he means by the crisis or the problem of transitivity, that it follows from this bigger conclusion. If we stick with this group, they kind of they have a transitive relation with the whole, right?
And he's kind of getting into that Althusserian notion of like structural causality. So he's sort of, as I read it, philosophically kind of pushing against a conception of structural causality.
So my point is that it follows from everything we've been discussing this far that there is no ideal for, without engagement and investigation, and again, political investigation, which is very different from sociological investigation or research, to assert from before what will always be the case. And I think we should be more retrospective with his claim, in the sense that the good question is, why did Marx at some point assume that workers are not only they are so many different things at once? They are inexistent, they are capable of organizing their own existence, and by doing so, it would transitively affect everything all at once, right? Because you could have some of these properties without the others. They could be inexistent without the capacity to organize their own existence by themselves. Some very, very pauperized, excluded, segregated populations, groups of people, social, don't have that second capacity, even though they exist, right? To a given situation. But also you can't have that power to organize and not automatically affect everything. So there is historical materialist explanations to why one would assume that the workers are in that special position. That's not a transcendental guarantee. That's a conjunctural situation. I think Badiou is just reminding us of that. And when is it the case that we start believing in this transitivity? When we lose reference, so we no longer are capable of just seeing how this is actually playing out. We just assume it plays out for some conceptual, logical deduction that it must be so, right? And I think that a lot of like Lukácsians who see that class in itself has not turned into class for itself, even though the conditions were there, are certainly scared, because it should be a Hegelian deduction that one thing leads to the other and leads to the toppling of whatever, right? But there hasn't. What is the historical example where the production of this political force hasn't then had to deal with all these new challenges, which are still there? They don't disappear. You don't gain much with the idea of transitivity on the ground you gain with the idea of transitivity theoretically and in certain specific discourses. So I don't see it as an argument about things change, there is no class, there is no centrality of workers. It makes no sense to make those statements theoretically. Like that's not very important. Like what decisions will make differently politically and collectively because you claim these things? Nothing.
Well, it would.
So just be complete. But I do think that the United States is going through a rediscovery of the question of labor.
Yeah.
And it's reminding itself of Marxism, of socialism, of the labor movement, and so on and so forth. And you guys have too much power, so you monopolize the conversation often. But that's a very regional conversation. That's not that meaningful a conversation. There's no, I mean, which political movement is struggling with the question of if class exists or doesn't exist? I don't know. I don't know why that's such a big deal. Like, so that's kind of why I think things get a bit kind of.
I'll tell you what. I think I have a clear answer, which is that we've seen a new emergence on the right of the successful perversion of class from within the discourse of the right, which let's call it pluralist or kind of open position of the left kind of left us a bit mowed over, or kind of like, because we were caught within this struggle of left populism in which the right was able to seize a sort of reactionary dialogue or discourse on class, which ultimately indexed all of the reference to class for the right, of course, were obscure culturalist references, and they were detethered, actually. I mean, they were tethered to economic concerns, but nothing in the vision was transformative. If anything, it was grounded in a kind of ressentiment politics, right? I think it's on that basis that the subtraction of a more rationalist prioritization of class becomes necessary for the transmission of the meaning of the left, the ideas of the left, as transmitted through our thought leaders and so on, right? This kind of idea is missing in a certain way, precisely as a countervailing force to the right's seeming monopolization on the class question. That would be my way to look at it. Now, there's a lot of ways the left does that are ineffective, because we have the theory, for example, of the PMC, which is in a way like one of the things we haven't adequately examined in the United States is the way that the PMC theory itself was hijacked and used in like the Doge, Elon Musk actions, for example. So there's a lot of ways that people are talking about class and not getting at it properly. I'm of the view that a task for us is to kind of continuously refine that question. So it's not so much that I want some strong Lukácsian history and class consciousness, Hegelian rationalism, unity of subject and object in itself for itself, although I'm not going to fully abandon that proposition. I don't think that. Now, that would be an interesting question, whether Badiou doesn't necessarily abandon that either, because one of the articles I encourage everyone to read is a lecture he gave, actually, I think it was in Brazil, called Academic Marxism and Real Marxism. It's
I think it was in France. It was in France.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was translated in Portuguese.
Yeah.
Anyways, this is a very compelling argument. In a way, we should introduce one of the things we haven't talked about, which is the notion of the communist hypothesis itself, right? Because from Can Politics Be Thought, that emerges as sort of one of the most seminal, like new propositions for a new direction of Marxism, but also a summary on Badiou's part of what is most novel about Marxism. What is the main idea of Marxism, right? And of course, he gets it from the letter on Wedemeyer. The main idea is dictatorship of the proletariat as the conclusion of Marx's life's work. That's the one discovery that's most novel. And then from there, Badiou then uses that idea doesn't necessarily abandon for, like, I don't know, branding purposes because we had Stalinism. He doesn't abandon what it signifies. He still wants to retain it. But he converts it into this notion of the communist hypothesis, right? Is that correct in your reading? Is that kind of the way that Badiou is sort of thinking about what remains the, because I like that point you said before that, yeah, like a field or like a condition, like Lacanian psychoanalysis or Marxism or whatever has like one main idea, right? So what's the main idea of the communist hypothesis? Now, some have argued that he extends beyond Marxism with communist hypothesis. I don't know if that's true, because I know in his letter to you and Dennis, he said this beautiful phrase, which almost brought a tear to my eye, about the true Marxists in today's time. But could you say something about that, maybe, on the communist hypothesis?
But you hit another point inside.
Please,
this
say anything you want.
Because of the right-wing thing, I just wanted to mention something, and I just want to contribute. I've tried to do this to you through audio messages and through annoying you in many, many ways. But I feel like this is worth saying sometimes, because I deeply respect the moment that American socialists are going through, and contribution of things like what you do here and everyone who's here is doing. But I do think you guys have a very distorted sense of how much what happens with you guys gives you the thermometer of what's happening everywhere. And it's not. You guys are lagging behind. You guys are not on the forefront anymore. And why I say this? For one reason, which I think it's something that, with the benefit of retrospection, I can tell you that it's going to bite you guys in the ass in the near future, which is right-wing discourse doesn't have the same conditions as Marxist thinking. You can say crazy shit and do crazy shit from afar with no consequence, blah, blah, blah. So just because the right is doing something doesn't make it the core priority of the day. It's always a fascinating, seductive option, and it sells a lot of books to say, well, if the right is in the politics of resentment, then we need to worry about resentment and blah, blah, blah. If the right captured the idea of class, now class is under dispute. No, you will know if class is under dispute if people are organizing and using the concept of class to do something and make decisions. Otherwise, it's selling books and having debates. That's just what it is. But it just makes us feel like it's a task of the day. The right cannot tell us what's the task of the day. It's the first line of the Communist Manifesto. I find it amazing how we always misread it. Like, the specter of communism kind of heightens the necessity of all the powers of old Europe to get together. But Marx doesn't mistake the specter of communism for communism. And he says, because the right has rallied against this fantasy, we need to put forward our real thinking to dismiss this kind of nursery tale of the specter. So my point is, these two things get mistaken. And a lot of these ideas about what is the crucial thing, PMC, the class, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but which movement, which collective force, who are we talking about? Where? In which? I had to learn all the states' names and cities in the states because of all the movies. So, like, where are we talking about? Who are these people? So I don't know. Like,
no,
what I see is something different.
I'll grant you the point that often my reference are two other leftist intellectuals, and one could criticize that as devoid of tethering to labor struggles. But let me just say this. I think when I say the right, I'm also referring to the Democratic Party and the liberal establishment as the right.
I think you're very right to do so. Yes.
Right. So, right. And in a way, in that, there's a particular problem there, which is that we haven't adequately demonstrated to many on the radical left the necessity to make principled breaks from that right, from that
Yeah, so
liberal.
that's what I say. I do think that there is a regional effective reason that I respect for making these distinctions. You guys are opening space for a lot of things and saying, no, this is not what I mean. That's fine. But that's what it is. It's important. But I just don't think that we should, like, I'm trying to mobilize everything I said up to this point as this other way into Badiou, because I do think, and use it in this part of the conversation, because I do think
we should go back to Badiou. We've kind of made a detour.
No. For me, it's not a detour. This is how you apply it. Because this type of question is the type of question that I think resituates some of the discourse.
Yeah.
Like, is Vivek Shiber or blah, 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 who is right? I mean, what are we doing?
Well, you could ask the stakes of, is the success of a particular perspective of a left-wing intellectual going to have a palpable organizing strength? And that's my presupposition, that in fact it would. That's why it matters to me. That's why it matters to me, because it would set a horizon of priority. Right now, Lenin spoke about this all the time, about the need for intellectuals to help in the crafting of slogans, in the refinement of principles, things like that.
Yeah, dude. But if I think an intellectual just arrived at Chris' next union meeting and said, I had this idea, nobody would listen. If you stay in a bunch of meetings and then you say, hey guys, from what John said, and then this guy said, this seems to be something that is at the core of what we're getting at. People will say,
well, hold on a second. So when we look at, a new idea I wanted to throw onto the table for everyone here is Lazarus's notion of the concept of a mode. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it is still thinkers that develop the contours of a mode. It's not like the Bolsheviks or this collective. No, it's still indexed to the labor of a particular thinker's intellectual practice. I'm just trying to clarify because, well, first of all, we can take a step back and define that. In Metapolitics, Badiou wrestles with his figure Sylvain Lazarus, who I'm talking to. They're very close comrades for many, many years. He famously wrote a book called Anthropology of the Name, and in that text, he develops this kind of periodization of Marxist history vis-a-vis this theory of the modes, and I want Gabriel to say something about it. It's all presupposing this fascinating egalitarian presupposition that people think.
Yeah, so before we get to Lazarus, just because you had the second question about the communist hypothesis, right?
Yes, and I had that too, yes.
Yeah, so I think those are connected. It's a good segue. But just so to conclude on what I was saying, I do think that that's kind of the way that not a Badiouian philosophical position, but a political position legitimated by the way that Badiou gives precedence to what we do as political militants, engaged people. That's how it could appear in a debate. So rather than appear as, yeah, but Badiou wrote in a text that class means this and that, like, he can be wrong. If I'm a Badiouian, I'm not going to take my politics from a text. And from where I'm standing and from what I know from comrades in other places, including the United States, it doesn't look to me like the core concept that is at crisis is labor or class. Like, I can be convinced otherwise, of course, but it is a relevant kind of example of how perhaps things can be reframed, which I don't think in any way takes the merit away of intellectual work. Though I do think, and then this bringing it to Lazarus and the communist hypothesis issue, I do think that, the reason why Badiou sticks with the word thought rather than the word theory or the word or like the problem of intellectuals, I think it's because thinking is a more ordinary, popular experience. Theorizing is something else. I do agree that theorizing is a specific practice and often has material and social and cultural conditions so that it falls on the task of specific shoulders to carry it through. Thinking, I totally disagree. I absolutely disagree. I think intellectuals think very little
But
politics.
then, if that's true, then why are the modes indexed not to the Paris Communards or the Bolsheviks or to I don't know, the Chinese Communist Party or something like this? Like collective. So what's the difference between a collective thought and the thought of a thinker?
So
I know you wrote a text on this.
Yeah, like I mean, I'll just go. I would just go as I mean, I think, but you gave an okay answer to this, which is proper names are sometimes the closest you get to anonymous masses, right? So nobody thinks Lenin did the revolution. That statement makes no sense, right? It makes sense because Lenin is a proper name that stands in for an anonymous, huge group of people, right? So there is a way out in that way. The second issue is we can go into specificity of Lazarus thinking. I don't want to go in there just because it would require a lot of explanation in terms of just how they differ, how they're similar. Clearly, there's a lot of similarity. So I'll just assume that everything I said here, it does apply a lot to Lazarus as well. But the way that he makes his scansions, I don't think they match Badiou's periodizing. Right. And again, right. Periodizing falls a bit inside of a process that we do from inside political processes. So, for example, there are political movements in Brazil today who rewrote their precursors. Like, if they are going in a right path, then those guys who did something crazy 300 years ago, they were better than we thought. They were on the right track. So periodization is part of a political process, not a sociological or historiographical thing. And both Lazarus and Badiou would agree that far, right? So what do I think then is the circuit or dialectics, if we want, of thinking in politics? And I think that this is exactly how we get to the communist hypothesis. I don't agree that technically speaking, the communist hypothesis in Badiou is the same as the dictatorship of the proletariat. He might write this at some point, but if the communist hypothesis has the status of a concept in this metapolitical sense, and metapolitics, if we were just to summarize what it means, is you don't want to have a theory of what people do politically because that's open and can change. So you need tools to facilitate sticking as close as possible to what they do. If you're a psychoanalyst, you know that meta-psychology in Freud, the meta works in a similar way. Psychology is something that people invent about themselves. So you don't want to impose a psychological theory on people. So what do? You have a meta-psychology, a theory that gives you tools to listen to the singular ways that people organize themselves, right? So metapolitics is meant to do the same thing. Give you tools to listen to how people organize themselves and take that as a serious thing. So as Chris kind of anticipated already here in the chat, communist hypothesis as a meta-political concept can only mean one thing. The world can be organized differently, right? Equality is conceivable. It's not even necessarily possible. I try to organize this, kind of systematize a bit how this appears in Badiou. I think we can divide actually 4 moments of this concept. You have the communist hypothesis, you have communist ideas, which are not the communist hypothesis, you have communist experiments, and you have something like we could call communist theory. And I think that communist hypothesis is at the level of equality is conceivable. I might live under capitalism, I might live under feudalism, but somehow I know I affirm we have capacity for something else. And that does shine a different light. We must ask ourselves, why is it that somebody who believed that things could be organized some other way, like Marx, was the one who actually figured out the complexities of the critique of political economy? It doesn't follow from the critique of political economy that communism should happen. It's because you are engaged with that point of view that you look at property, at price systems, and so on, and you say, yeah, but this is historically determined. It could be otherwise, right? So communist hypothesis has no content. It's just the affirmation that it is conceivable It's something like equality.
Can I say one thing here? There's also this notion of the invariant principle or sort of argument that politics takes on true politics historically appears in a world at the or can be kind of gauged, right, when it is indexed to such a demand of the masses or of the people, right? So, and this is found through some kind of claim that politics is ultimately like there's this debate between Milner and Badiou over like World War II, which is World War II ultimately is a response to the fragmentation of the world as the disarray of the interjection of the egalitarian maximal equality of 1917. And it's kind of like, it's then kind of causally fragmented from there, but history is driven by that maximal affirmation in some sense.
Yeah, sure. But let me try to just finalize the schema. Maybe
Please,
then...
I'm just saying because like that to me is such a fascinating way of thinking political novelty, and the theory of the event of politics is all indexed to that. But please, I'm sorry for interrupting.
I'll go back to this because I think it's a relevant point, but just to try to spell this out a bit more. So I'd say communist hypothesis in Badiou means this capacity to think equality. Does it mean to realize equality, to realize it in a certain way? No, nothing like this. But it's true that if you're not interested in conceiving that, you're probably not going to be interested in what happens politically. You're going to say people are not trying to achieve greater equality. They're just trying to, get their own share of the pie. They're resentful. They are in it for the violence or whatever. Now, what is a communist idea? Is the attempt to build a content for that hypothesis through the material elements of a given historical moment. But it's an idea, as we said. So an idea is something like, this is possible. So we move from the conceivable, which might be impossible, to the possible, but definitely not necessary, nor even actual, right? And there are many, many, many communist ideas, right? And you rarely can see them as all part of the same kind of history if you're not engaged with the communist hypothesis. If you think that the hypothesis is not interesting, you're also not going to see anything in common between, as I was saying, indigenous struggles, the Black liberation struggles, trade unionism, feminist struggles. You'll just say, these are just different things. So there are many ideas, and the hypothesis gives us a light to understand that there are many ways to extract from material reality the means to say, but maybe this is possible. Then, because we're talking about ideas and not talking about ideals, we need to test out the consequences. That's why you need communist experiments, which is where you learn things. Why do I call it experiments? Because it's an investigation about the content of the idea, the way you conceptualize it, and the limits of that idea in the real world, and what the hell is the real world, right? Communist experiments also helped us to learn what the hell is the world around us. Because when you go against the world, it resists, and then you see who's who, right? But there are always limits to these things. And you have communist theories, which are attempts to extract some type of kind of lesson from negative and positive aspects of experiments to keep on going with our hypotheses, with our conception that equality remains something we can think, right? So I think that Badiou's theory of the communist hypothesis is actually plural in that way. It has different moments. And how do I get to your last point is that I made that snarky critique of just allowing the right wing's developments and the fascination with how deep in the hellhole we are to kind of set out our priorities sometimes, or what are the necessary debates or not. Because the beauty of the example you just gave in Badiou's reading of the Second World War is that the statement that the masses make history, the masses alone make history. What it does say is that the most complete, the most expressive version of history is the one that takes the side of experiments towards equality, because it's from the standpoint of those experiments that you get to see what other things are: resistances, attempts to negotiate with that force, and so on and so forth. Whereas when you take the other side and just take these events as, yeah, of course it was always end up in violence, it will always end up in these things, you don't learn anything, right? So the fresh, open, living history is told from the perspective of radical politics, right? So I think those things are connected, and it just goes back to this idea that there is some vertigo in moving the whole analytic architecture that we have to explain social facts, to explain social dynamics, to move the whole of it and put it in the hands of political processes and let them evaluate what's meaningful and what's not in this huge apparatus, and say, holy crap, I spent 10 years studying the Lacanian jouissance. That's not a relevant concept. Maybe. I don't know. It's not up to me to judge. It's what's going on. Like making that displacement at the level also of historical intelligibility. You know, there is a vertigo to that process. But again, that's the type of politicization of Marxism that follows from Badiou's proposal, right? Political language, political concepts, political ideas, these are post-evental generic fragments. They are not an analytic toolkit that will allow you to tell what's going on from outside. That's
why a lot of Marxists that are maybe like, you know, readers of Nietzsche or Adorno, or who really pay close attention to Marx in the 19th century as a critic of bourgeois equality, will have the tendency to be very critical of Badiou's concept of equality. But I think it's a misreading, though, right? Because Badiou's not a historicist in this way. So he's not drawing up a claim that the type of equality that is repeated in these moments of like the masses make history is necessarily indexed to bourgeois society or to the bourgeois cultural mode of power. Could you say something about that? Because this is a common, like, and you can see why Marx, I'm not going to blame them, but I can see why they would be upset about it, right? And I mean, Nietzsche does have a point on this point, and Marx also has a point that that equality is the hallmark of bourgeois ideology. So maybe you could say something about that.
Yeah, I think that's crazy.
But it's true. I mean, like, at what point does it move from an idea to ideology? It's the distinction between idea and ideology.
Yeah, but like, just because you speak about things in one way, like, who in the world looking at things and people would say, yeah, clearly equality is a major concern for the way capitalism is organized? Like, again, it's well, if you're not concerned with reference, with practice or anything, and you're just talking about like bourgeois ideology, sure, yeah, but that's not really...
No. It's exactly what Connor says. It's a part of a particular operation of humanistic ideology. So there's a way in which the invocation of equality can itself be perverted, can be distorted, can be furthered for capitalistic ends. So that's why, like, Lenin Lenin had the argument that proletarians need an educative and pedagogical opportunity for the cultivation of equality beyond capitalism. So when we speak about equality within capitalism, we're speaking about equality within capitalism.
Yeah, I again, like, my
you
point,
don't see this as an issue or a problem. It's not really a
I don't
problem.
see this as an issue. I think that words mean things in context. Therefore, is there, can I conceive of a context where equality means something bad or purely ideological? Yes, of course. Can I conceive of situations where nobody's going to mistake it for bourgeois equality? Yes, I can also. I don't know how to discuss these things in a vacuum because in practice they don't exist in a vacuum. So there's no like language slips and ideology takes advantage of this. Blah, blah, blah. It's fine, but I don't know. Like I think that what I find perhaps as the best antidote to this, and I again find it that Badiou is very much siding with it, is that uh, there's and I'd say that this is one of the core ideas. Now that we get to ideology, one of the core ideas of Badiou's project, that I would summarize it with the idea that construction is the best critique. But what does it mean in his work? You don't find after a couple of years where you did have a theory of ideology, he has a book on it. After a while, he doesn't really focus on this anymore. And already at the level of, at the time of the concept of model, you already have the assumption that you don't need to criticize, you don't need to do as Althusser wanted and have a sort of philosophical critique of the spontaneous philosophy of scientists, because doing science is the best critique of scientism. You don't need a critique of an abstract critique of the bourgeois forms of love, because building relationships is the best critique of that kind of psychological ideology. And political organizing is the best critique of political ideology. Yeah, Chris just mentioned this very technical point, but you don't solve the probably he's only the one who's going to understand my point here, but you don't solve the problem of covering over with constructible sets by making a critique of constructible sets and covering overs with of infinite things with finite parts. You uncover something by building something, right? Generic procedures are not ways of talking about things; it's a ways of building things. It's a theory of construction. And that's why it's so paradoxical. It's a theory of how to construct something that's not constructible, right? In the technical sense of construct with normative, prior normative criteria. So the core of ideology critique in Badiou is done through political practice. Because if you keep at it, there are some things you simply cannot hold as true if you're really pairing with what's going on in front of you. So I think that equality, for example, is a good example. I'm not saying that there isn't many different problematic ideological uses of the idea of equality. In the strict Althusserian sense of equality helps to project people in an imaginary way into the blah, blah, blah. Yes, there are. But if you, rather than engage with the nuance of the origin of bourgeois equality and so on and so forth, I think that the ways of seeing that are most effective and recuperating a different idea of equality that might take many names, doesn't need to be equality as a word. Sometimes it's, we have something in common, we cooperate as equals. I don't know, it appears in many ways, right? Is true, seeing that it's one of the most decisive things you can have in politics is some sense of equality. So many things are done differently. If you have that in mind, it's 100 times more important to know how to work your way around the way equality appears in people's thinking in their daily collective lives,
Right.
than having a stake on if labor is the core concept of not. And I think that, again, it's not because labor is not central. Of course it is central, but I don't need to tell everyone that gravity is outside of my door for it to be real. I need to build things taking gravity in consideration, and I will have to name something like gravity at some point, right?
I see. Yeah.
I like the idea that, I really like this crazy statement by Lenin that Marxism will win because it's true, right?
Oh yeah.
Because you know what it means? That if you dropped Marxist language, you would rediscover it around the corner. the
Right.
least of our worry should be holding too closely to words that identify us in this or that way. Because if you're practically engaged with these things, people will rediscover them, and they have, you know. And when you read, holy shit, this is just Marx. You
Right.
should cry because it's a miracle that these things are so real that people will go back to them, regardless of if they read Capital or not. So I do think that this goes back to that ideal versus idea, right?
Yeah, it's a wonderful distinction. Yeah.
A Marxism full of ideas is a Marxism that is more enamored of the fact that people come up with ideas, and those ideas miraculously look like previous things that other people thought,
Yeah.
rather than concerned that if we don't have a clear ideal of how things should play out, they won't happen. That's not conviction. That's not confidence in other people. That's not solidarity. That's not believing that other people are think things through just as much as you. And what I can tell you, man, is that it's crazy. Political life does confirm that this is the case. Like, the more you approach things as everyone is thinking through their situation the best way they can, if they already decided to engage with something, like, it's madness to engage with change.
Yeah.
It always brings problem before it brings solutions. And people do this, it's because they're taking an energy from the same place as you are. And that humbleness, I think it's something that is at a very, very, very deep core of what Badiou is doing. So yeah.
No, it's beautiful, man. And I mean, I apologize. We weren't able to get into the letter that you and Dennis wrote to
No, but that's not
Badiou.
that, not that important. I mean, you can just invite me back,
We can
but
mention it. I mean, yeah, we can mention it, and it would be nice if Dennis were with us, but maybe you could say a couple of things. I mean, I just looked at the time. It's been 2 hours and 40 minutes. But it's really a blessing to have you. I feel like it would be nice to have Gabriel come like once every 2 months with like a set date. He just comes and we do this again. Because I do always feel like we get deep, but there's so much more. There's so much more. So I got two final things. One is, what can you say that you didn't mention before about Badiou and Marxism? And then two, just tell us a little bit more about this very interesting project of taking the categories of logics of worlds and applying it back to Marxist capital, if that could be summarized. But maybe before you do that, is there anything along the way that maybe didn't get said that you want to kind of elaborate in our final few
no,
minutes
I
together?
think before I say something about this letter, I mean, I imagine most people don't know this. I send this to you and to your group, but it's not published. I'm not sure if it ever will. I didn't write it for it to be published. Uh,
But you guys also
uh,
have a book. You've written a book, so that is different. That's
yeah, I mean, so, but yeah, it kind of. I mean, we might publish this very long text that we wrote that is just a manuscript for now. It's on our one of our group's website, but we've never really published it, which is this thing that you just said. It was our first attempt at really kind of going through the detailed kind of reformulation of Marx Capital through Badiou's categories from Logics of Worlds. But we never published it. But we were just invited very recently to publish it. We might do next year, I think. But yeah, so what I would say, just as before we go into that, just as a kind of recapitulation to kind of close off this thing, just as the pedagogical responsibility, since we're talking about reintroducing Badiou somehow, right? To go back to the beginning here, I do think I didn't mention this, so I think this is relevant. Like, there is no academic place for Badiou in Brazil, not even in this French theory way. He was simply not received as an author in Brazil for 2 decades. So most people who were in this conference I was talking about are like students, like graduate students who decided to study the guy in their free time. And they learned about him through other types of groups because they just wanted to do it. And I think that is clear in the way that you find a certain common approach of not really splitting his work into these segmented parts, being as interested in what his opinions were that he generalized about politics to based on his own experiences, as seeing that his system is not reducible to that somehow. I think it follows from this very particular reception that we had. Brazil is a very politicized country with mass movements, central left, kind of left center, Workers' Party and things like this, and we have the challenge of thinking through what is politics in this context, and I think this all does give a different color to this group of people who are engaged with his work, and I do feel like it's a very interesting thing. Though I think it's a broader phenomena that's happening, that people are engaging with his work differently. I think definitely I would add you and many of our comrades who circulated here as part of this new approach as well. And what I think is the summary of this general introduction is a genuine interest for what exists inside these conditions that is legitimate forms of thinking, and it's not reducible to the political version of Badiou's theory or something like this. And it's not something everyone sorted out, but it's an impasse that became worthy of interest. And I don't think that was the case in the past. That's a new thing. And I think it's much better to approach his work from that perspective. And I do think that the strongest motivations that will lead anyone to go to the trouble of trying to read the Being an Event trilogy, which is very complicated. Don't trust. I would start with the trilogy if you want to get at it. I wouldn't start with Theory of the Subject, which I think it's more conjunctural. And since if there is a continuity between the work, you can start with the later stuff. You're not gonna. It's not like a retraction of the hardcore Marxism. It's not. But it's very hard, and it requires a lot of study. It's not the same as just reading a book. So if you're not very motivated, it's very hard to work through that. So I say find. I think that to find a motivation in this non-philosophical material is core to then having the energy to actually study this material and trying to work your way around it. So that's how I would summarize what we mean by a reintroduction, right? That maybe historical conditions in the past haven't really facilitated this particular thing. But then to conclude, just like in the process of engaging with Badiou's work in this way, which in a way led me not really to focus on publication, I've generally studied his work with comrades, and we've used political experiences and other things as motivation for keep going at it. It's been a long time since we've been engaging with his work as part of a research collective that exists since 2016 called the Subset of Theoretical Practice. Is now changing its name. It's now called the Common Space of Organizations because
I love the new name.
It's been absorbed by an organization that we have that is much more practical than the research group. But
yeah, it's wonderful.
But the core of the work we did was not focused on Badiou. It was focused on finding the good theoretical framework to account for such different political experiences as we've had in Lebanon, different places in Brazil, United States, different countries in Europe. Like, it's very dissimilar. And Badiou was very, very helpful in this. I do believe that confirmed to me the conviction that he's somebody worth studying. But it also highlighted some things which I don't conceive them as critiques in the sense of, oh, this is untrue, this is distorted or whatever, but something like it made us see that some of the ways he formulates saying things at the most technical level, the mathematics of it and the conceptual interpretation of the mathematics, that kind of gives the backbone of his system, that some of these statements are unnecessarily particularized in the sense that you could generalize a bit more his system. You could allow it to account for some level of difference that the way that it's framed right now, it doesn't make it clear, and people just have to work that out as they go in their own political, social lives, right? And we've put a lot of effort in these two directions at once. One is showing that yes, there is space for most of Marxist analytic tools from the critique of political economy inside his system. It's not something that doesn't fit there. It does, and it actually has novel consequences. So this work we did does show that you can derive technical aspects about capital formation, simple and expanded reproduction of capital, surplus value extraction, transformation problem, all these things that are crucial to Marxology, they can be reconstituted within his approach, which has the benefit of meaning that you can recuperate most of Marxology from within the most political version of Marx, right? Those things are compatible. That's part of it. And the second part of the project has been understanding, well, but we need to, and this is the project that we've called rereading the theory of value, rereading capital through his categories. But at the same time, we realize that, especially due to third world politics and dependency theory, world systems theory, and other things, that other material that captures better than he does the differences, the more concrete differences in social conditions for political struggle, that we might develop a theory of what we could call a social world that is general enough to allow for the distinctions between how the working class is oppressed and organized by a productive a mode in a center of capitalism versus the periphery of capitalism. There are ways to have a technical discussion about what does it mean to be at the periphery of a world versus at the center of a world. So we've been also working on adding some stuff to his system, which again, because of everything I told you guys today, he built a system where he doesn't have the keys to the house. Because most of his core concepts are based on very knowledgeable and kind of pedestrian use of mathematics. If you can find other mathematical structures that are consistent with the ones that he used, he doesn't have the power of saying that those things don't follow. You're just extracting further consequences from what he said. And if you can provide a conceptual interpretation of these new formal concepts that is consistent with his conceptual system, then you've added things to his system, regardless of whether he agrees with it or not. So those are the two things we've been working on. But again, motivated by what? Motivated by the fact that the type of political inventivity we've been seeing and the struggles we find in our own political engagements, they do seem to suggest that there are aspects of the form of politics, form of organizing, and as a Platonist, Badiou needs to care about form, that are relevant for many different political processes. They could be made more intelligible as part of what generic procedures must deal with. And to be very blunt, I don't think that to put it in these terms might be deceiving, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with the way Badiou talks about what he calls singular universality of an inventive procedure. Something in singularity, right? Something in the production of a new type of painting is just a particular thing, but it colors anew the whole of the art system, right? Some new political experiment might reverberate and make us look in a new way to the whole of the political field. But we shouldn't allow the really existing universal dimension of singular things to cloud the fact that communist politics also requires us to stitch together many political experiments to build and accumulate force. And that's not accounted for in the theory of bodies and organs or the theory of finite and infinite parts of generic procedures. That's that organizing aspect and that that kind of compositional aspect of how do different political forces find ways to become interdependent and to acquire a certain form that is not going to be the form of any of those thoughts in themselves. We do believe that that's something that everyone is experiencing. It's from everyone we investigate, every political process we investigate. This is a core problem. It's not contradictory with his system, but it's not intelligible in his system as a one set of issues. And you can find formal tools that allow you to make that extension of his system and add these concerns. So that's what we've been working on for 10 years now, I guess.
And how do people like join your group if they're, or like, is it open for that kind of inquiry? People to learn more
Yeah.
about if I wanted to say, wow, this is insane, I want to learn more. I'm a madman like you.
Yeah. So
what would I do?
So we changed our approach recently for a couple of reasons. So we used to place all our videos for all our meetings on YouTube, and we used to just invite everyone to join. But we're now engaged with a bunch of different political movements, and we require a bit more of kind of just knowing people before we bring them on. But if you just send us an email, I think it's still subset of theoretical practice at gmail.com. I know, Daniel, you're in our Discord, so you can also just let us know if somebody wants to engage with. But so there are many ways to engage. It's just not something like we just send people links these days.
Got it.
But there are many ways to do that, and we're publishing in the next few months the first 4 or 5 chapters of the book we just finalized, which summarizes our stance. It's not a book on Badiou, but it's a book on the summary of this research for the last decade and the political lessons we've learned from our different engagements. And it's looking pretty good. It's called Investigate, Compose, Continue. It's really cool work.
I want to thank you for your time and coming back on Emancipations. I hope comrades can support us on Patreon. The link is below, or if not, you can see it in the description of YouTube. We have some exciting things on the horizon in terms of study groups. That is somewhat TBD. We just finished a lot of work. We're kind of taking a little bit of a summer pause at the moment, but we'll be kicking that back up in the fall. We have a weekly meeting with our Lacan cartel every Thursday night. So folks can reach out to me if they're interested in joining that on our side. But I do mean it when I say it would be nice to have you back here more regularly. I really like this approach, and even a part 2 on Badiou, because again, we only talked about his Marxism, which is just a little, it's a big part of his work, but there's a lot more. And yeah, I think you've opened up a lot for us. So I just want to thank you, Gabriel, for.
It was my pleasure, man.
Almost 3 hours. My wife is now going to kill me, but
yeah, I have the same problem here.
I'll blame it on you.
Sure, I'll do the same.
Yeah, please. Okay.
So there, yeah.
Okay, all the best, comrades.
See you all. Bye-bye.
See you guys.